In the previous chapter, we discussed how and why we measure variables. In this chapter, we will focus on the instruments we will use to measure those variables. Questions to ask before measuring. There are 6 questions that we can ask ourselves to help us make a choice when trying to decide on a measurement variable. I will be using the example of determining if a relationship between the variables depression and sleep patterns exist to help further evaluate each of these questions. The first question, why do we want to make the measurement? Figure out the relationship between variables, define levels, exploratory versus explanatory, and it all depends on the purpose. So in order to study if a relationship does exist between 2 or more variables, we need to select one of the 3 general reasons below that applies to our study. The first one is, are we doing it for assessment and diagnosis? Well, in this example of looking at depression and sleep patterns, we are not assessing or diagnosing anyone of either of these, whether it be depression or of sleep deprivation. The next one would be evaluation of practice effectiveness. In our example, we are not looking at a specific practice that applies to depression or sleep patterns. The last one is applied research. Determining if a relationship between variables exists is research, and the findings will hopefully be applied to our collective knowledge. The point of making this choice is to determine how the measurement will impact others. The more the research will impact the lives of others, the more accurate the measurement must be. We must also consider the level of the research being conducted. If this is the beginning of the research, we call it exploratory, we may only be able to come to tentative suggestions that our 2 variables, depression and sleep pattern, exists. However, if much is already known about these variables and we are conducting a more descriptive or explanatory study, then we can link what we measure and the findings we report to the most thorough and accurate results. The next question is, what do we want to measure? In our example, we want to measure depression and sleep patterns. A measuring instrument can be wideband or narrowband. Wideband instruments measure a broad trait or characteristic. Narrowband measures a particular aspect of that trait. For our example, wideband will give us an overall picture, whereas narrowband will only look at a specific part. The next question is, who will make the measurement? Many people can play a role in making the measurement. What is important to know is that no matter who is collecting the data, a clear understanding of the tool and the procedures for using the tool is essential for reliable and accurate results. The next question is, what format do we require? Most measuring instruments contain many questions that, when tallied together, determine the results for a particular variable. These types of measuring tools are called summative scales, using multiple responses to provide a more accurate picture of the variables being measured. The next question is, where will the measurement be made? Our decision on where the measurement will be made will be completely dependent upon the variable being observed. To accurately identify sleep patterns, video recordings taken directly from a client's home are going to be much more reliable than video recordings taken from a client sleeping in a laboratory setting. So thus, deciding to make our measurements at the client's home is better than in the field. When will the measurements be made is our last question here. For research designs, the dependent variable, which in this case is depression, is represented by the letter O, and the independent variable, which is sleep patterns, is represented by the letter X. In our design, we need to make an initial measurement of the dependent variable, in this case depression, then introduce the independent variable, sleep patterns, then measure the dependent variable again to see if we can make those links. Types of measuring instruments. The type of measuring instrument you choose to measure your variables when your research study depends on your research situation, the questions you are asking, the kind of data you need, the research participants you have selected, and the time and money that you have to complete that research. The first is journals or diaries. These are very useful for an interpretive study. Using our example of depression and sleep patterns, let's say you want to explore housewives' sleeping patterns, so you give them each a journal and have them evaluate their sleep from the night before. This is called retrospective data. This data can cause issues with accuracy depending on the time between the recording the information and the actual event itself. In addition, the journal is also reliable if the event itself can be written about in detail. According to the text, a qualitative study that seeks to uncover not just the experiences themselves, but the meaning attached to them by the research participants, and the meaning may emerge more clearly if the participant is encouraged to reflect, as such in a journal or in a diary. The next measuring instrument is a log. These are most often used in a field placement. Logs are a structured type of journal that require the user to record specific information such as who, what, when, and where in a more organized way. The next measuring instrument is an inventory list. These are made by the research participants. For example, they need to make a list of things that make them feel more depressed. The next is a checklist. Checklists are prepared by the researcher. They are often used to help the researcher measure a particular variable. In this case, having the participant check through several items on a list can help the researcher measure depression. These are usually yes or no type answers. And the last one is a summative instrument. Likert scales provide a greater range of responses than inventories or checklists. A summative research instrument allows the researcher to sum or get a total from a number of items or questions. The value of the score corresponds to the researcher being able to link the responses to a variable like depression. Questions are often arranged with a Likert type scale ranging from never to rarely, sometimes, and often as choices of responses related to levels of depression or any other variable interested in. Standardized measuring instruments. These are widely used in social work, and they have been extensively tested. From a representative sample, from a large sample, from a homogeneous sample, and very recently. In the Hudson's Index of Self-Esteem, the purpose is to use a summative type instrument to identify the level of self-esteem of a participant. Any person who scores above the 30 plus or minus 5 can potentially have a clinically significant problem with self-esteem. To norm the test, over 1,700 individuals were tested, representing many different populations to ensure the tool is measuring the same variable for all the people it is used on. Scores are calculated by adding all the responses and using the calculated score to identify where a person, based on the score that they receive, would fall in a range. The range of scores provides the researcher the ability to rule out or rule in the possibility of a particular variable being present or not present. So, measuring instruments that are standardized come complete with information on the results of that testing, the purpose, what it's meant to do, the description, what it will measure, and the cut scores, or the range of scores like we discussed with the Hudson's Index on Self-Esteem. The norms, who was it validated on, the different groups, because we know different groups may respond differently. The scoring, instructions on how anybody can score it, how reliable it is, and the validity of the actual tool itself. How do we evaluate standardized measuring instruments? There are several criteria that must be considered when it comes to evaluating measuring instruments that you will think accurately measure the variables in your study. The first is the sample from which the data was drawn. Ensure the population from which the sample of participants was taken is sufficiently large, it's homogeneous, it's up to date, and representative. The second is the validity of the instrument. The content is clearly defined, the criterion is reliable and valid, the theoretical constructs are clearly stated, and it is able to discriminate from irrelevant variables. The third is the reliability of the instrument, ensuring there is sufficient evidence of internal consistency and stability over a relevant time interval. And the fourth is the practicality of the instrument. Is it the appropriate length? Is it feasible for the participants to complete? Is it sensitive to measuring changes? Is it easy to score? Is it socially acceptable to respondents? These are questions and things you will look at in evaluating standardized measuring instruments. The advantages of standardized instruments are readily available and they're easy to access. The development work has already been done. They have established reliability and validity estimates. The norms may be available for comparison. Most are easy to complete and to score. In many instances, they are available free of charge. Just doing a Google search, you'll find several of them. They may be available in different languages. They specify age range and reading level. And the time required for administration has already been determined. So what are the disadvantages of standardized measuring instruments? The norms may not apply to the target population. The language can often be difficult. The tone might not fit with the philosophy of the program. For example, deficit-based versus strength-based. The target population may not understand the translation. The scoring procedure may be overly complex. The instrument may not be affordable. Special qualifications or training might be required for use, and the instrument may be too long or time-consuming to administer. So where can we locate standardized measuring instruments? The publishers, the professional books and journals, and authorization to use the test and experience required. Once you decide to measure a variable through the use of a standardized instrument, the next consideration is we got to find it. I really think there are two general sources to find these instruments. First is the publishers. These are professional publishing companies that can be found on the internet, providing the sale of the standardized measuring tools. The instruments can be costly, however, the benefit is they have been deemed to be reliable and valid based on an extensive use and testing. Professional books and journals, the most common place to find a measuring instrument related to your area of study. They're referred explicitly in the methodology section, and sometimes an exact copy of the tool is often provided in the appendix of the journal paper. This graph identifies common tests used in social work research, its relationship to dependent and independent variable. If it's continuous, if the variable can take on any value between its minimum value and its maximum value, it's called a continuous variable, otherwise it's called a discrete variable. A dichotomous variable are variables that have two levels. A very common example of a dichotomous variable is gender, which has two outcomes and is reported as male or female. Let's look at the first one, correlation. We're looking for a correlation between two variables, so there we'd have one independent and one dependent variable. It's a continuous type of independent variable for both dependent and independent, and its purpose is to measure how one variable moves with another. So for example, if depression increases, does your sleep deprivation increase as well? Or is it an opposite? If depression increases, sleep deprivation decreases. It is that correlation that we'd be interested in from our example.